Some losses cut so deep they change who you are forever. When 58-year-old Hal buried his wife after her long battle with cancer, he didn't just lose his partner, he lost himself. Desperate to reconnect with his teenage daughter Riley, he moved them back to his childhood hometown and took a job at the local museum. One afternoon, while hiking the same cliffs where he'd played as a boy, Hal found a cave that hadn't been there before. Inside was something impossible, a giant cocoon, 7 feet tall, pulsing with life. When it cracked open, what stepped out wasn't a monster. It was a beautiful, shifting creature that looked at Hal with eyes that seemed to know his deepest pain. The being appeared to mirror his own grief, but how could that be possible? What was this creature, and why did it feel like it had been waiting for him all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of their cramped apartment above Henderson's hardware store, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Hal Morrison sat at the edge of his narrow bed, turning Sarah's wedding ring between his fingers, a ritual he'd performed every morning for the past 18 months. The simple gold band had grown loose on his finger, just as everything else in his life had become unmoored since her death. "Dad, we're going to be late again," Riley's voice carried through the thin wall separating their bedrooms. At 17, she possessed her mother's direct manner of speaking, but none of Sarah's warmth remained in her tone when addressing him. Hal slipped the ring back onto his finger and reached for his county museum ID badge from the nightstand. The plastic felt flimsy between his calloused fingers, a far cry from the substantial weight of the construction foreman's hard hat he'd worn for 23 years before Sarah's illness forced him to take lighter work. The museum job paid barely enough to cover their basic expenses, but it was all Millbrook had to offer someone his age, with his particular combination of skills and limitations. Their apartment consisted of 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen that doubled as a living room, and a bathroom where the hot water lasted exactly 7 minutes on a good day. Sarah would have found a way to make it cozy, would have hung pictures and arranged the few pieces of furniture they'd managed to bring from their old house to create the illusion of home. But Hal lacked that particular talent for transformation. To him, the apartment felt like what it was, a temporary stopping place for people who had lost their way. "I'm making coffee," he called through the wall, knowing Riley would decline. She'd inherited her mother's preference for tea, but had rejected most everything else that connected her to their shared past, including family breakfast conversations. The kitchen counter held exactly 4 items: a coffee maker Sarah had bought him for his 50th birthday, a toaster that worked only when tilted at precisely the right angle, a ceramic mug reading "World's Best Dad" that Riley had painted for him in elementary school, and a stack of overdue bills he pretended not to see each morning. The sight of that mug caused the familiar tightness in his chest, a reminder of simpler times when being Riley's hero required nothing more than pushing her on the playground swing or reading bedtime stories about princesses and dragons. Through the kitchen window, he could see the Methodist church where Sarah's funeral service had been held. The building looked smaller than he remembered, its white paint peeling slightly near the roofline. Beyond the church, the Cascade Mountains rose in familiar layers of green and gray, exactly as they had during his childhood in this same town. 40 years ago, some things at least remained constant. Riley emerged from her bedroom, wearing the same black jeans and oversized sweater she'd worn for the past 3 days. Her dark hair, so much like Sarah's, hung in her face. A curtain she'd learned to hide behind during the worst months of her mother's illness. At 17, she moved with the careful distance of someone who had learned too young that loving people meant eventually losing them. "Museum duty calls," she said, gathering her backpack without making eye contact. Their morning routine had become a choreographed dance of avoidance, each of them moving through their small space while maintaining careful emotional distance. "I could drive you to school," Hal offered as he did every morning. "I'll walk." The same response, delivered in the same flat tone that had replaced her once bright laughter. Hal nodded and poured his coffee, watching through the window as Riley made her way down Main Street toward Millbrook High School. Her shoulders carried a weight that belonged to someone much older, and he recognized the posture. It was the same way he'd walked through the world since Sarah's death. Grief, he'd discovered, was a physical thing that settled into your bones and changed how you moved through space. The Millbrook County Museum occupied a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street, its faded grandeur a testament to the town's more prosperous past. Hal's official title was Curator of Local History and Collections Maintenance, which meant he catalogued artifacts, led the occasional school tour, and fixed whatever was broken on any given day. The work suited his temperament. Quiet, methodical, and largely solitary. Margaret Holloway, the museum director, greeted him with her usual mixture of maternal concern and professional efficiency. At 62, she possessed the kind of unflappable competence that kept small institutions running despite chronic underfunding and community indifference. "How are you settling in, Hal?" she asked, though they both knew he'd been asking himself. The same question every day for the past 6 months, without finding a satisfactory answer. "Getting by," he replied, which was both true and utterly inadequate as a description of his current existence. Riley adjusting to the new school. Hal hesitated. The honest answer was that Riley was adjusting exactly as well as could be expected. For a teenager who'd lost her mother, her home, her friends, and her sense of security in the span of 18 months. Which was to say, not well at all. "She's finding her way," he said instead, because Margaret meant well, and there was no point in burdening her with the full extent of their struggles. The museum's main floor housed the permanent collection, Native American artifacts, pioneer farming equipment, and a modest display about the region's logging history. Hal's favorite section occupied the back corner, the geology exhibit featuring local mineral samples and fossil specimens dating back millions of years. There was something comforting about the vast timescales represented in those ancient stones, a perspective that made his current troubles feel both significant and temporary. His office was located in the basement, a cramped space that smelled perpetually of old paper and cleaning supplies. 3 metal filing cabinets contained decades of acquisition records, donor correspondence, and research notes compiled by his predecessors. The work was often tedious, cataloguing donated items, researching provenance, maintaining environmental controls for preservation. But it provided structure to his days and a sense of useful purpose that had been missing since Sarah's death. Around noon, he climbed the stairs to lead a tour for a group of 4th graders from the elementary school. The children moved through the exhibits with the restless energy of people for whom history was still something that happened to other people in other times. Their teacher, a young woman who reminded him painfully of Sarah at that age, asked thoughtful questions about the Native American pottery collection. "Mr. Morrison," one boy asked, "did you find all these old things yourself?" "Some of them," Hal replied, "but most were found by people who lived here long before I was born. They saved these things because they understood that objects tell stories about the people who used them." The boy nodded with the serious expression children reserved for concepts they didn't quite understand, but sensed were important. After the tour, Hal returned to his basement office and opened the afternoon's project, a collection of items donated by the Brennan family estate. The deceased woman had been a lifelong resident whose children lived in Portland and wanted nothing to do with their mother's accumulated possessions. This was how history survived, through the discarded belongings of people whose stories had been forgotten by everyone except small-town museum curators. Among the donated items was a leather-bound journal from the 1940s, its pages filled with careful handwriting that documented daily life during World War II rationing. There was also a collection of hand-painted china that had belonged to the woman's grandmother, and a wooden jewelry box containing tarnished brooches and a handful of love letters from a soldier who might or might not have made it home from. Franz Hal photographed each item, assigned it a catalogue number, and wrote brief descriptions that future researchers might find useful. The work required patience and attention to detail, qualities that his previous career in construction had also demanded, though in very different ways. Building houses had been about creating something new and solid that would shelter families. For generations, preserving artifacts was about maintaining connections to people and times that might otherwise be lost completely. At 4:30, he locked the museum and walked the 6 blocks home, taking the long route that led past the elementary school where Riley had attended 3rd grade during their previous stay in Millbrook. The playground equipment looked newer than he remembered, but the same ancient oak tree dominated the back corner of the yard, its thick branches perfect for climbing. He found Riley at the kitchen table, supposedly doing homework, but actually staring out the window toward the mountains. Her textbooks lay open but untouched, pencil resting against a blank sheet of paper. "How was school?" he asked, knowing the question would be met with minimal response. "Fine. Any interesting assignments?" "Not really." This had become their standard exchange, a ritual acknowledgement that they were both trying to maintain some version of normal family interaction while avoiding any conversation that might venture into dangerous emotional territory. Hal opened the refrigerator, surveying their options for dinner. The contents were predictable: lunch meat, bread, eggs, a bag of apples that were approaching their expiration date. Sarah had been the one who planned meals, who somehow managed to transform basic ingredients into satisfying dinners that brought them together around the table each evening. Without her organizing influence, their eating habits had devolved into whatever required the least effort and discussion. "Sandwiches okay for tonight?" he asked. Riley shrugged, which he interpreted as consent. They ate in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts that had grown too familiar and too heavy to share. Through the window, the mountains caught the last light of the afternoon sun, their peaks glowing with the same warm colors Hal remembered from countless childhood evenings spent exploring the foothills and canyon trails that surrounded the town. After dinner, Riley retreated to her bedroom, and Hal found himself standing at that same kitchen window, studying the landscape of his youth. Somewhere up there, beyond the tree line, were the caves and rock formations where he'd spent countless summer days as a boy, imagining himself as an explorer, discovering ancient treasures or hidden civilizations. Those adventures had felt utterly real at the time, filled with the kind of wonder that adult life had gradually stripped away through responsibility and disappointment and loss. He touched Sarah's ring, feeling its familiar weight against his skin. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful cataloguing and quiet preservation, another evening of polite distance from the daughter who looked more like her mother every day, but seemed to be drifting further from him with each passing week. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, his thoughts kept returning to those childhood mountains, to the sense of possibility that had once made every trail worth exploring and every shadow worth investigating. Something was stirring in his memory, some half-recalled dream or long-buried hope that made the familiar landscape seem, for just a moment, full of mystery once again. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Hal woke before dawn, as had become his habit, and found Riley already awake in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea and staring out at the peaks with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thought I might hike up to Eagle Point today," he said, pouring his coffee. "Want to come along?" Riley looked up, surprised. They hadn't done anything together outside their apartment routine since moving back to Millbrook. For a moment, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Interest, maybe, or simply curiosity about this unexpected invitation. "I guess," she said, finally. "I don't have anything else planned. It wasn't enthusiasm, but it wasn't refusal either. Hal felt a small spark of hope as they packed water bottles and trail mix into his old hiking backpack. The trail to Eagle Point began just outside. A town, winding up through stands of Douglas fir and vine maple toward the limestone cliffs that dominated the eastern skyline. Hal had hiked this route countless times as a boy, often with his father during the brief period when his parents' marriage had been stable enough for family outings. The path felt familiar under his boots, awakening muscle memory from a time when his legs had been shorter and his sense of adventure much larger. Riley walked beside him without complaint, though he noticed she kept her earbuds in for the first mile. Gradually, as the trail grew steeper and the views more dramatic, she pulled them out and began paying attention to their surroundings. "Mom would have loved this," she said suddenly, stopping at a viewpoint where the entire valley spread out. Below them, it was the first time she'd mentioned Sarah unprompted in months. Hal felt his throat tighten but managed to respond. She always said the mountains were where she felt closest to something larger than herself. "I remember." Riley's voice was soft. She used to say the peaks were like prayers made out of stone. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, sharing the kind of moment Hal had almost forgotten was possible between them. Then Riley shouldered her pack and continued up the trail, and he followed, grateful for even this small connection. At Eagle Point, they sat on the familiar granite outcropping and shared their trail mix while watching hawks circle the thermals. Below, the view encompassed everything Hal loved about this place: the deep valleys carved by ancient glaciers, the layered ridges that seemed to go on forever, the sense of being connected to something timeless and enduring. "I used to come up here when I was about your age," he told Riley. "Sometimes with friends, but often alone. There are caves all through these cliffs, places where you can go and just think without anyone bothering you." "Did you find anything interesting in them?" "Depends on what you mean by interesting. Old campfires from previous explorers, a few arrowheads, lots of bat guano." He smiled at the memory. "Mostly what I found was quiet. Sometimes that's the most interesting thing of all." They began their descent around noon, taking a different route that Hal remembered led past some of the more accessible cave openings. He wasn't sure why he felt drawn to show Riley these places. Perhaps it was simply the desire to share something from his own youth, to give her a glimpse of who he'd been before grief and responsibility had worn away most of his rough edges. The first cave they encountered was exactly as he remembered it. A shallow depression in the limestone face, large enough for a few teenagers to sit comfortably, but not deep enough to be truly mysterious. Riley peered inside with mild interest, then continued down the trail. But the second opening stopped him in his tracks. "That wasn't there before," he said, staring at what appeared to be a genuine cave entrance about 30 feet off the main trail. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been up and down this trail hundreds of times, and that opening wasn't there when I was a kid." He studied the rock face, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "It's possible there was a rockfall that opened it up, but, Dad, you're talking about something that happened 40 years ago. Maybe you just forgot." Hal shook his head. "I didn't forget. I never forgot anything about these mountains." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because Riley followed him off the trail toward the cave entrance. As they got closer, Hal could see that the opening was definitely recent. There were still limestone fragments scattered around the entrance, and the exposed rock face inside showed none of the weathering and discoloration he would have expected. "From decades of exposure, we should probably head back," Riley said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was studying the cave mouth with the same curiosity he felt. "Just a quick look," Hal said, pulling a small flashlight from his pack. 5 minutes. The cave entrance was narrow, but opened up quickly into a much larger space. Hal's flashlight beam revealed smooth walls and a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above them. The air inside was warmer than he'd expected, and there was a subtle sound, a rhythmic pulsing, like a distant heartbeat. "Dad," Riley whispered, grabbing his arm. "Look, at the far end of the cave, perhaps 50 feet from the entrance. Something. extraordinary waited in the darkness. Hal's flashlight beam fell upon what could only be described as a cocoon, but unlike anything he'd ever seen or imagined. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its surface appearing to be woven from some kind of iridescent material that shifted between deep blue and silver in the flashlight's glow. The entire structure pulsed gently, as if something inside was breathing. "What is that?" Riley's voice was barely audible. Hal moved closer, fascinated despite his rational mind's protests. The cocoon's surface was warm to the touch and seemed to respond to his presence, the pulsing rhythm increasing slightly as he approached. There were no visible seams or openings, but he could sense movement within, something alive and aware. "We should go," Riley said. But she was moving closer too, drawn by the same inexplicable attraction he felt. "In a minute," Hal murmured, studying the cocoon's surface. There were patterns in the material, designs that seemed almost familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen them before. The pulsing continued, steady and reassuring, like a parent's heartbeat heard from within the womb. Then, without warning, everything changed. A crack appeared along what might have been the cocoon's centerline, spreading rapidly upward and downward with a sound like breaking glass. Light spilled from the opening, not the harsh white of his flashlight, but something softer and warmer, like moonlight filtered through water. Riley grabbed his hand as they watched the cocoon split open completely, its 2 halves falling away, to reveal what had been growing inside. The being that stepped out was unlike anything in Hal's experience, yet somehow not frightening. It stood roughly human height, with a form that seemed to shift between solid and translucent, as if it were made of living water touched by starlight. Its features were delicate and symmetrical, neither distinctly male nor female, and when it turned to look at them, Hal found himself staring into eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. But it was the expression in those eyes that stopped his breath entirely. The creature looked at him with perfect recognition, as if it had been waiting specifically for him to arrive. More than that, it looked at him with an understanding that went straight to his heart, seeing past his defenses and pretenses to the grief and loneliness he carried like a stone in his chest. In that moment of connection, Hal felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. The sensation of being truly seen by another consciousness. Not judged, not pitied, but simply understood in all his broken humanity. The creature moved toward them with fluid grace, and when it reached out one luminous hand toward Hal's face, he didn't pull away. The touch was electric, sending waves of sensation through his entire body, not pain, but a kind of recognition that resonated in his bones. And suddenly, impossibly, he was seeing through the creature's eyes, experiencing its emotions as if they were his own. He felt its deep sadness, its sense of displacement and longing, its profound need for connection and understanding. The emotions were alien in their intensity, yet utterly familiar in their essence. It was grieving, just as he was grieving. It was lost, just as he was lost. Riley was crying, though she didn't seem to realize it. "Dad," she whispered, "what's happening?" Hal reached for her hand while maintaining contact with the creature. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think we're not alone anymore." They stayed in the cave for another hour, though time seemed to move differently in the creature's presence. Hal found himself sitting cross-legged on the cave floor, while the being, he couldn't think of it as it anymore, though he had no sense of its gender, knelt beside him with one translucent hand resting gently on his shoulder. Riley had overcome her initial fear and was asking questions with the kind of scientific curiosity that reminded Hal painfully of Sarah. "Can you understand us? Do you have a name? Where did you come from?" The creature couldn't speak in any conventional sense, but it communicated through touch and something deeper, a direct transfer of emotion and imagery that bypassed language. Entirely. When Riley reached out tentatively to make contact, she gasped and pulled back. "It's so sad," she said, tears streaming down her face, "but also hopeful, like it's been waiting for something for a very long time." Hal nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Through their connection, he could sense the creature's profound loneliness, but also its gentle nature and deep capacity for empathy. It seemed to feed on emotional connection, growing slightly brighter and more solid the longer they remained in contact. "We should probably head back," Hal said eventually, though he was reluctant to break the connection. "People will wonder where we are." The creature seemed to understand, stepping back and inclining its head in what might have been gratitude or farewell. As they prepared to leave, it touched the cave wall and somehow conveyed the idea that it would wait for them to return. The hike down felt surreal, as if they were returning from another world entirely. Riley walked close beside him, and for the first time in months, she initiated conversation. "Dad, what do you think it is?" "I honestly don't know, but I don't think it means us any harm." "Me neither." She was quiet for a moment. It felt familiar, like meeting someone you've known your whole life but just forgot about. Hal knew exactly what she meant. The creature's presence had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death, a sense of wonder and possibility that he'd thought was gone forever. That evening, they sat at their small kitchen table eating takeout Chinese food and trying to process what they'd experienced. Riley was more animated than she'd been in months, asking questions and theorizing about the creature's origins and purpose. "We can't tell anyone," Hal said finally. "Not yet. Not until we understand more about what's happening." Riley nodded. "Margaret would probably want to turn it into a museum exhibit." The thought made them both laugh, and Hal realized it was the first time he'd heard Riley's genuine laughter since before Sarah's diagnosis. Monday morning brought a return to routine, but everything felt different. Hal found himself distracted, at work, mechanically cataloguing artifacts, while his mind wandered back to the cave and its mysterious inhabitant. During his lunch break, he found himself in the museum's geology section, studying the fossil displays with new interest. The specimens were millions of years old, trilobites, ancient ferns, creatures that had lived and died long before humans walked the earth. But looking at them now, Hal wondered what other forms of life might have visited this planet over the vast spans of geological time. The thought didn't seem as far-fetched as it would have a week ago. Margaret found him there, staring thoughtfully at a display case containing Devonian-era marine fossils. "Finding inspiration in the ancient past?" she asked with a smile. "Something like that. Margaret, have you ever come across any local legends about unusual phenomena in the mountains? Strange lights, unexplained encounters, that sort of thing." She raised an eyebrow. "Planning to add a supernatural exhibit to our collection?" "Just curious. I've been hiking up there again, remembering some of the stories my father used to tell. Well, there are the usual Native American legends about spirit beings and guardian creatures. The Cowlitz tribe has some beautiful stories about star people who would visit the mountains during certain celestial alignments. But as far as modern encounters," she paused, considering. "There was something back in the late 50s, I think. Some hikers claim to have seen strange lights near Eagle Point, but it was never investigated seriously." Hal felt his pulse quicken. "Any written records? There might be something in the local newspaper archives." The Millbrook Gazette used to cover every odd story that came through town. Why the sudden interest? Just trying to understand the area's history better. For Riley, mainly. She's been asking questions about local folklore. It was a weak excuse, but Margaret seemed to accept it. That afternoon, Hal spent his break time digging through the newspaper archives in the museum's research room. He found the article Margaret had mentioned, a brief account from August 1958 describing unexplained luminous phenomena witnessed by several hikers near the limestone cliffs. The witnesses described seeing a soft, pulsing light that seemed to move with intelligence before disappearing entirely. The description sent chills down his spine. Whatever they'd encountered in the cave might not be an isolated incident. Riley was waiting for him when he got home, her backpack already prepared. "For another hike." "I've been thinking about it all day," she said. "We have to go back." Hal had been thinking the same thing. Despite his rational mind's protests, he felt drawn to return to the cave with an urgency he couldn't explain. It was as if something important was waiting for them there, something that might change everything if they were brave enough to pursue it. They made the hike in comfortable companionship, sharing observations about the changing autumn colors and the migrating birds. Overhead, Riley pointed out things she'd noticed during their previous visit. Unusual rock formations, places where the vegetation seemed lusher than expected, subtle signs that this area might be somehow different from the surrounding landscape. The creature was waiting for them, standing just inside the cave entrance, as if it had known they would return. In daylight filtering through the opening, Hal could see that it appeared more solid than before, its form more clearly defined. The connection they'd established seemed to have strengthened it somehow. This time, Riley was less hesitant about making contact. She sat beside the creature and placed her hand on its arm, closing her eyes as waves of communication flowed between them. "It's showing me things," she said softly. "Images of stars and distant places, but also memories of being alone for a very long time." Hal joined the connection and immediately felt the creature's joy at their return. Through the shared link, he began to understand that their presence was somehow healing for the being, that it had been weakened by isolation, and was growing stronger through their emotional bond. But there was something else, too. A sense of urgency, as if time was running out for something important. The creature couldn't communicate complex concepts clearly, but Hal got the impression that it needed their help with something, that their meeting hadn't been accidental. As they prepared to leave after an hour of communion, the creature touched the cave wall again and somehow conveyed an invitation, or perhaps a request. It wanted them to return tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. It needed their presence in ways they were only beginning to understand. Walking home in the golden light of late afternoon, Hal felt a sense of purpose stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Whatever was happening in that cave, whatever impossible circumstance had brought them together with this extraordinary being, it felt like the beginning of something important. For the first time in 18 months, he was eager to see what tomorrow might bring. 3 weeks into their daily visits to the cave, Hal discovered Sarah's journal tucked behind a box of Christmas decorations in their bedroom closet. He'd been looking for extra blankets to take to the creature. The October nights were growing cold, and somehow he sensed that the being needed warmth and comfort as much as emotional connection. The leather-bound book fell open in his hands to a page dated just 2 weeks before Sarah's death, her familiar handwriting still clear, despite the tremor that had affected her hands during those final days. "My dearest Hal," the entry began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you finally worked up the courage to go through my things. I know how you avoid dealing with difficult emotions. It's one of the things I love about you, even though it drives me absolutely crazy sometimes." Hal sat heavily on the bed, his hands shaking as he continued reading. "I've been having the strangest dreams lately. Maybe it's the medication, or maybe it's whatever comes when we're getting ready to leave this world. But I keep dreaming about light, not the harsh clinical light of the hospital, but something warm and alive. In these dreams, you and Riley are standing in this light, and you both look healed, not just sad anymore, but genuinely at peace. I know I'm leaving you both in a terrible place. Riley's so angry, and you're already building those walls around your heart that you think will protect you from more hurt. But Hal, my love, you can't live the rest of your life in a protective shell. Riley needs you to stay open, to keep believing in wonder and possibility even after I'm gone. Promise me something when you're ready, and you'll know when you're ready. Go back to those mountains where you played as a boy. Take Riley with you. Show her the places that made you believe in magic when you were young. I have this feeling, this certainty I can't explain, that when you're both ready to heal, something will be there, waiting to help you. Trust the light. when you find it. Trust the impossible when it presents itself. And please, please trust that love doesn't end just because someone dies. It changes form, but it never disappears. Hal closed the journal and sat in silence for several minutes, feeling Sarah's presence as strongly as if she were sitting beside him on the bed. The timing of finding this entry felt like more than coincidence. It felt like guidance from beyond, the veil that separated them. That afternoon, he shared the journal entry with Riley during their hike to the cave. She listened with tears streaming down her face, then hugged him tightly for the first time since Sarah's funeral. She knew, Riley whispered against his shoulder. Somehow, she knew we'd find something to help us heal. The creature seemed especially responsive that day, its form brighter and more substantial than ever before. When Hal shared his memory of reading Sarah's journal, the being's entire body pulsed with what he could only interpret as recognition and approval. Through their psychic connection, he felt waves of comfort and reassurance, as if the creature understood exactly what Sarah had meant about trusting the light. But their peaceful routine was about to face its first serious challenge. On Thursday morning, Margaret pulled Hal aside as he arrived at work. Her expression was troubled, and she spoke in the lowered tones reserved for sensitive topics. Hal, I've been getting some unusual inquiries about you and Riley. Apparently, several people have noticed you hiking up to Eagle Point every day for the past few weeks. Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store mentioned that you've been buying camping supplies and extra food. Hal's heart began to race, but he kept his expression neutral. Riley and I have been spending time in the mountains. It's good for both of us to get outside. Of course, and I think that's wonderful. But there's also been talk about you asking questions about local legends and strange phenomena. People are starting to wonder if you're handling the stress of your move appropriately. The implication was clear. In a small town, any deviation from expected behavior became the subject of speculation and concern. Hal realized. They'd been naive to think their daily disappearances wouldn't be noticed. Margaret, I appreciate your concern, but Riley and I are doing better than we have in months. The hiking is therapeutic for both of us. I'm sure it is, but perhaps you could vary your routine a bit. Visit some of the other trails in the area. It would help quiet the gossip, and it might even be good for you to explore new places. Hal nodded, understanding that this was friendly advice disguised as a gentle warning. If they continued their current pattern, more questions would be asked, and eventually someone might decide to investigate what they were doing in the mountains every day. That evening, he and Riley discussed their options. They could reduce their visits to the creature, varying the timing and location of their hikes to avoid suspicion. They could try to find a different way to access the cave that wouldn't require using the main trail. Or they could continue as they were and risk discovery. I don't want to stop seeing it, Riley said firmly. Not now, when we're finally starting to feel like ourselves again. Hal understood completely. The creature's presence had become essential to their healing process. Through their daily connections, he was beginning to process his grief in healthy ways for the first time since Sarah's death. Riley was sleeping better, talking more, even showing interest in her schoolwork again. But there was another factor to consider. The creature itself seemed to be growing stronger and more defined with each passing day, as if their emotional energy was helping it develop or heal from some kind of injury. What would happen to it if they suddenly stopped coming? We'll be more careful, Hal decided. Take different routes, space out our visits, maybe bring hiking gear so it looks like we're just exploring different areas. But we're not abandoning our friend. Riley smiled at his use of the word friend. It was the first time either of them had verbally acknowledged that the creature had become something more than just a mysterious discovery. It was a relationship, perhaps the most important one either of them had formed since Sarah's death. The next morning brought another complication. Hal arrived at work to find a message on his desk from the United States Geological Survey. requesting information about any unusual seismic activity or geological formations reported in the Eagle Point area during the past month. His blood ran cold as he read the official letterhead and formal language. Someone, somewhere, had detected something unusual happening in their mountains. The question was whether the inquiry was routine or whether they were already under observation. Margaret appeared in his doorway, her expression grim. That came by special courier this morning. Hal, what exactly have you and Riley been doing up there? For the first time since finding the creature, Hal felt the weight of genuine fear settling over him. Whatever was happening in that cave, whatever healing process they'd stumbled into, it might be about to come to an abrupt and unwelcome end. That afternoon, while supposedly organizing the museum's mineral collection, Hal found himself studying the cave painting reproductions in the Native American exhibit with new eyes. The Cowlitz tribal artifacts included several pieces that depicted tall, luminous figures interacting with human forms in what appeared to be ceremonial or healing contexts. One painting in particular caught his attention. It showed a group of native people gathered around a glowing being whose form seemed to shift and flow like water. Above the scene, stars were arranged in a pattern that looked almost like a map, with lines connecting certain celestial bodies to the central figure. "Those are fascinating pieces," said a voice behind him. Hal turned to find Dr. Elena Vasquez, the local librarian who had recently begun volunteering at the museum on weekends. She was a woman of his own age, with graying hair pulled back in mesa, a practical ponytail, and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to notice everything. Since Sarah's death, several well-meaning friends had suggested he might enjoy Elena's company, but he'd resisted any social connections that might lead to emotional complications. The tribal elders who donated these pieces said they depicted actual historical events, Elena continued, moving to stand beside him at the display case. Not mythology, but memories passed down through generations. Historical events? Hal tried to keep his voice casual. What kind of events? Visitations from what they called the star-touched, beings of light who would appear during times of great sorrow or transition to help heal emotional wounds. According to the stories, these beings could share in human grief and transform it into something redemptive. Hal felt his pulse quicken. Did they say when these visitations were supposed to have occurred? The most recent accounts date to the late 1800s, during the period when the tribe was being forced to relocate to the reservation. But the elders insisted the star-touched return whenever they're needed most, following patterns that align with celestial events. Eleanor paused, studying his face with curious eyes. "You seem very interested in these particular legends." "Just trying to understand the cultural context better," Hal said, though he could feel her perceptive gaze reading between the lines of his response. That evening, he shared his discovery with Riley during their now carefully varied approach to the cave. They'd taken a longer route through the forest, approaching from the north side of the ridge to avoid the main trail where they might be observed. "Star-touched," Riley repeated thoughtfully as they climbed through the underbrush. "That's a beautiful name for what our friend might be." The creature, Hal found himself thinking of it as star-touched now, seemed especially communicative during their visit. Through their shared connection, it began showing them images that felt like memories rather than imagination. They saw vast spaces between stars, a journey of incredible duration, and a sense of purpose that had drawn it across impossible distances to reach this particular place at this particular time. But the most powerful vision it shared was of Earth itself, seen not as a single moment, but as a flowing stream of time. They witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the migration of peoples, the endless cycles of birth and death and renewal that characterized all life. And through it all, moments of connection between the star-touched and humans who needed healing, brief intersections of mortal and immortal, finite and infinite. It's been coming here for thousands of years, Riley whispered, tears streaming down her face as she processed the visions. Always to help people who are lost or grieving. Hal understood now why Sarah's journal had spoken of light and healing with such certainty. Somehow, in her final days, she had sensed this opportunity approaching and had prepared them to recognize it when it arrived. But their growing understanding brought new concerns. If the Star-Touched had been visiting Earth for millennia, why were government agencies suddenly taking interest now? What had changed that might draw unwanted attention to their mountain sanctuary? The answer came 3 days later, when Margaret showed him a newspaper clipping from the Portland Tribune. The headline read, "Unusual energy signatures detected. In Cascade Range, scientific team dispatched to investigate." The article was brief and heavy on technical jargon, but the essential message was clear. Sophisticated monitoring equipment had detected anomalous electromagnetic phenomena in several locations throughout the mountain range, including the area around Eagle Point. A joint team from the USGS and an unnamed federal agency would be conducting field investigations over the next several weeks. "Hal," Margaret said quietly, "I need to ask you directly. Have you and Riley encountered anything unusual during your hiking trips? Anything that might explain why federal investigators are suddenly interested in our quiet little corner of the world?" Hal met her eyes, seeing genuine concern mixed with professional curiosity. Margaret had been kind to them since their arrival in Millbrook, and she deserved better than lies and evasion. But telling the truth would put the Star-Touched at risk and possibly endanger the healing process that was slowly bringing his family back to life. "We've seen some beautiful country," he said carefully. "Nothing that seemed particularly unusual from a scientific standpoint." Margaret nodded, but he could see she wasn't entirely convinced. "If you do encounter anything unexpected, anything at all, I hope you'll let me know. These federal teams can be quite disruptive to local communities, and it would be better if we understood what they were looking for." That evening, Hal and Riley sat in their kitchen discussing their increasingly complicated situation. The Star-Touched needed their continued presence to maintain its healing work, but government investigators were closing in on the very area where they'd been meeting. Soon, the mountains around Eagle Point would be crawling with scientists and federal agents. "We have to warn it," Riley said. "Tell it that it might need to hide or go somewhere safer." Hal nodded, but privately he wondered if the Star-Touched had options for hiding. From their shared visions, he understood that the being's appearance in their cave wasn't random. It had been drawn to that specific location by forces beyond human comprehension. Could it simply relocate if its sanctuary was threatened? As he prepared for bed that night, Hal found himself looking through Sarah's journal again, searching for any additional guidance she might have left them. Near the very end of her entries, he found a passage he'd missed before. "I dreamed again about the light, but this time the dream was different. There were other people around you and Riley, people who wanted to take the light away and study it like a laboratory specimen. In the dream, you had to choose between keeping the light safe and keeping yourselves safe. Choose the light, my love. Always choose the light, no matter what it costs. Some things are more important than safety." Hal closed the journal and stared out their kitchen window toward the dark mountains, feeling the weight of decisions he wasn't ready to make. Somewhere out there, the Star-Touched waited in its cave, trusting them to return tomorrow, as they had every day for weeks. But tomorrow, everything might change. The Star-Touched gave Hal a gift on their next visit, a fragment of crystalline material that had somehow formed during the creature's emergence from its cocoon. The piece was no larger than a silver dollar, but it pulsed with the same gentle light that emanated from the being itself, and when Hal held it, he could sense the creature's presence, even when they were apart. "It wants you to keep this with you," Riley said, interpreting the waves of emotion flowing from their luminous friend, "like a connection that doesn't break when we leave the cave." Indeed, as Hal pocketed the crystalline fragment, he felt a subtle but constant awareness of the star-touched's emotional state. It was comforting in ways he hadn't expected, a reminder that he was no longer truly alone in the world. But the gift came with a troubling revelation. Through their enhanced connection, the star-touch began communicating more complex ideas, and one message came through with painful clarity. Its time on Earth was limited. The being had not come here to stay permanently, but to complete a specific healing mission. When that work was finished, it would need to return to wherever it had come from among the stars. Riley was devastated by this news. Over the past month, she had formed an attachment to the creature that went beyond simple friendship. It had become a surrogate for all the emotional support she'd lost when Sarah died. The thought of facing another abandonment, even for reasons she intellectually understood, brought back all her fears about loving people who eventually left. "How long do we have?" she asked, through tears during their connection with the being. The answer came in images rather than words, a pattern of stars that suggested seasonal change, the moon cycling through several phases, and a sense of completion approaching but not yet immediate. Perhaps a few more weeks, maybe a month or two if they were fortunate. Walking home that evening, Hal struggled with emotions he'd thought he'd learned to control. Just as he was beginning to open his heart again, just as Riley was starting to heal from her mother's loss, they were facing another separation that would leave them bereft once more. "It's not fair," Riley said, echoing his thoughts. "Why do we have to keep losing everyone we care about?" Hal didn't have an answer that would satisfy either of them. But that night, he found himself thinking about Sarah's final words in her journal, about choosing the light over safety. Perhaps the star-touched's eventual departure wasn't meant to be another loss to endure, but a completion they were meant to help facilitate. The federal investigation team arrived in Millbrook the following Tuesday, bringing with them an array of sophisticated equipment and a level of official scrutiny the town hadn't experienced since the interstate highway bypass debates of the 1980s. Hal watched from the museum as black SUVs and equipment trucks made their way toward the mountain access roads, his stomach tight with anxiety. Dr. Patricia Williams, the team leader, was a geophysicist from the University of Washington, who spoke with the measured authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. She visited the museum that afternoon to interview Margaret about any unusual reports or local knowledge that might be relevant to their investigation. Hal remained in his basement office during the meeting, but he could hear Dr. Williams's clipped questions echoing down the stairs. Any reports of unusual electromagnetic phenomena, unexplained lights or energy sources, local residents behaving in ways that suggest exposure to unknown influences. That last question made his blood run cold. Were they already under suspicion, or was this simply part of a standard investigation protocol? After Dr. Williams left, Margaret found Hal in the archives room, ostensibly researching early settler accounts, but actually trying to stay out of sight. She was particularly interested in reports of people making frequent visits to specific locations in the mountains, Margaret said, without preamble. Apparently their monitoring equipment has detected not just energy anomalies, but consistent patterns of human activity in areas that should be relatively isolated. Hal felt the crystalline fragment pulse gently in his pocket, as if the star-touched were responding to his emotional distress. "Did you mention Riley and me?" I told her. "You'd been hiking regularly for therapeutic reasons following your wife's death." She seemed to find that explanation reasonable. Margaret paused, studying his face carefully. "Hal, I've known you for 6 months now, and I've watched you change during that time. When you first arrived, you were barely functional. Now you seem, I don't know how to describe it, peaceful, centered. Whatever you and Riley have been doing in those mountains, it's been good for both of you." "It has been," Hal admitted. "Then please be careful. Dr. Williams and her team aren't necessarily concerned with what's best for local residents. They're here to investigate anomalies and collect data. If they perceive you as part of their research parameters, they won't hesitate to turn your healing process into a case study. That evening, Hal made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. He called Elena Vasquez and asked if she'd like to join him for coffee at the diner on Main Street. It was time to stop hiding from human connections, particularly if his time with the star-touched was going to be cut short by federal intervention. Elena accepted the invitation with the kind of calm pleasure that suggested she'd been hoping he would eventually ask. Over coffee and pie, they talked about books, about the challenges of single-parenting older teenagers, about the ways that loss and healing intersected in unexpected patterns. "I lost my husband 8 years ago," Elena said quietly. "Heart attack. At 51. For the longest time, I thought that was the end of everything meaningful in my life." "What changed?" Hal asked. "Time, mostly. And the gradual realization that love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It transforms into something different, something that can still grow and change and connect you to other people." She smiled at him over her coffee cup. "Sarah sounds like she was an extraordinary woman. I'd like to hear more about her sometime, if you're willing to share." The offer was gentle and genuine, without any of the awkwardness he'd expected. For the first time since Sarah's death, Hal found himself imagining what it might be like to have adult companionship again, not as a replacement for what he'd lost, but as something new and valuable in its own right. Walking Elena home that evening, he felt the crystalline fragment pulse with what seemed like approval. Even facing separation from the star-touched, even with federal investigators closing in on their mountain sanctuary, he was beginning to understand that healing meant staying open to new connections rather than retreating into protective isolation. But first, he and Riley needed to help their luminous friend complete whatever mission had brought it across the vastness of space to their small corner of Earth. The revelation came during what Hal thought would be an ordinary evening visit to the Star-Touched. Riley had stayed home to finish a history report, leaving him alone with the creature for the first time in weeks. As they established their psychic connection, the being's communication took on an urgency and clarity that surprised him. Instead of the usual gentle sharing of emotions and abstract concepts, the star-touched began transmitting what could only be described as a structured message, a deliberate communication meant specifically for him to understand. The images began with Sarah lying in her hospital bed during those final weeks, her body failing, but her spirit somehow luminous with an inner light Hal hadn't recognized at the time. He watched through the creature's perception as Sarah's consciousness reached out beyond the boundaries of her physical form, searching for something in the vastness that surrounded their small world. Then came the impossible part, Sarah making contact. Through the star-touched shared memory, Hal witnessed his wife's final prayer. Not the desperate pleading he'd expected, but a calm, purposeful communication with intelligences that existed between the stars. She had somehow sensed their presence and called out to them with the same certainty she'd once shown when calling their family to dinner. "Please," Sarah's spirit had whispered into the cosmic darkness, "my husband and daughter are going to need help learning how to heal. They're good people, but they don't know how to grieve without building walls around their hearts. When they're ready, when they've suffered enough to be open to wonder again, please send someone to show them that love doesn't end with death." The star-touched had answered her call. Hal broke the psychic connection abruptly, staggering backward as the full implications hit him. Everything, their return to Millbrook, his decision to hike the childhood trails, the discovery of the newly opened cave, had been orchestrated, not by coincidence or fate, but by Sarah's deliberate intervention from beyond death. The creature approached him gently, its luminous form pulsing with what he now recognized as profound compassion. Through their renewed connection, it showed him more, how Sarah's consciousness had guided it to this specific location, how her love had provided the energy needed for its journey across impossible distances, how her final gift to her family had been arranging for their healing even after she was gone. "She sent you," Hal whispered, his voice breaking. "She actually sent you to us." The star-touched's affirmation filled his mind like warm light, accompanied by waves of Sarah's love, transmitted across time and space. For the first time since her death, Hal felt her presence clearly, not as a memory or wishful thinking, but as a continuing reality that transcended physical existence. But the revelation brought devastating clarity about something else. The federal investigation wasn't coincidental either. Through the creature's enhanced perception, Hal began to understand that Sarah's prayer had created what could only be described as a beacon in the cosmic fabric, a signal that had drawn the star, touched to Earth, but had also attracted the attention of human monitoring systems. The same love-driven energy that enabled the healing connection had generated the electromagnetic anomalies that brought Dr. Williams and her team to Millbrook. Sarah's gift was about to be discovered and destroyed by the very people who claimed to be protecting humanity from unknown threats. Hal sat in stunned silence as the full scope of their situation became clear. The star-touched hadn't come to Earth as a random visitor. It was here on a specific rescue mission, sent by his dead wife to heal the family she'd been forced to leave behind. But their time was running out. The federal team was closing in, and soon they would find the cave and take the creature away for study and experimentation. "What happens to you if they capture you?" he asked through their connection. The answer came in images of sterile laboratories, invasive procedures, and slow death by separation from the cosmic energies that sustained the being's existence. The star-touched wasn't just physically different from humans. It was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of clinical analysis that would inevitably follow discovery. But there was more. Through their deepening bond, Hal began to sense something he hadn't noticed before. Riley was changing in ways that went beyond emotional healing. Her natural empathy was developing into something extraordinary, enhanced by her contact with the star-touched into a genuine psychic ability. She was becoming capable of the same kind of cosmic communication that had allowed Sarah to call for help in the first place. The implications were staggering. If the federal team discovered Riley's enhanced abilities, they wouldn't just take the star-touched for study. They would take her too. That night, Hal sat at his kitchen table staring at Sarah's journal, finally understanding the full meaning of her final entries. She had known this day would come when he would have to choose between keeping the light safe and keeping themselves safe. She had been preparing him for the moment when protecting the star-touched would require risking everything else, but she had also been preparing him for something else, the possibility that letting the star-touched complete its mission might mean losing it forever, just as he'd lost her. Around midnight, Riley emerged from her bedroom, drawn by the same psychic disturbance that was keeping him awake. The crystalline fragment in his pocket was pulsing rapidly now, transmitting waves of urgency and distress from their friend in the cave. "Dad?" Riley's voice was small and frightened. "I'm seeing things, visions of the star touched in danger and people in white coats trying to hurt it." Hal pulled his daughter close, feeling her trembling against his shoulder. "The visions are real, sweetheart. We're all connected now, and our friend is trying to warn us about what's coming. What do we do?" It was the question that would define everything that came next. Hal thought about Sarah's words, about choosing the light, about Eleanor's gentle reminder that love transforms rather than disappears, about the gradual healing that had brought him and Riley back from the edge of despair over the past few months. The star-touched had been sent to heal them, but now they needed to save it. The student had become the teacher, the healed had become the healers. Sarah's final gift had been more than just arranging for their recovery. She'd been preparing them for the moment when they would need to act with the same selfless courage she had shown during her final days. "We're going to help our friend," Get home, Hal said quietly, surprised by the certainty in his own voice, no matter what it costs us. Riley nodded against his shoulder, and he felt her psychic abilities reaching out to comfort the star touched across the miles that separated them. His teenage daughter, who had been broken by grief just months ago, was now capable of cosmic communication that most humans couldn't even imagine. Sarah's plan was working perfectly. The question was whether they were strong enough to see it through to completion before Dr. Williams and her team turned their healing miracle into a nightmare of scientific exploitation. Outside their kitchen window, the mountains stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and somewhere among those peaks, an otherworldly being waited for them to prove worthy of the love that had brought it across the universe to heal their broken hearts. The next morning brought urgent news that changed everything. Margaret called Hal at 6:30, her voice tight with concern. Dr. Williams just informed me that they've detected what they're calling a significant energy focal point somewhere near Eagle Point. They're planning a full-scale investigation starting tomorrow morning, complete with helicopters and a mobile laboratory unit. Hal's blood turned to ice. How specific is their location data? Specific enough that they've asked the county sheriff to block access to the entire northern trail system as a safety precaution. Hal, if you and Riley have been hiking up there regularly, you need to find somewhere else to spend your time for the next few weeks. After ending the call, Hal sat at his kitchen table trying to process the reality that their time had run out. In less than 24 hours, the mountains would be crawling with federal agents armed with equipment sophisticated enough to detect the star-touched's energy signature from miles away. There would be no hiding, no evasion, no way to protect their friend from discovery unless they could help it leave before the search began. Riley emerged from her bedroom already dressed for school, but her face showed the same grim determination. He felt. "I heard you talking to Margaret," she said quietly. "We have to go to the cave today, don't we, before they find it?" Hal nodded. "We need to understand exactly what our friend needs to get home safely, and we need to understand it fast." But first, he had a difficult conversation to initiate. Over the past month, several members of the community had begun to notice the positive changes in both his and Riley's behavior. Margaret had commented on his renewed sense of purpose. Elena had mentioned how much brighter and more confident Riley appeared during their brief encounters at the library. Even Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store had remarked that they both seemed to have found their footing in Millbrook. These people cared about them, and if Hal and Riley were about to do something that might put them at odds with federal authorities, their friends deserved to know the truth. He started with Elena, calling her during her lunch break at the library. "I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible," he began without preamble. "But I need you to trust me enough to listen with an open mind." Elena's response was characteristically calm. "I'm listening." Hal told her everything. The discovery of the cave, the star-touched, Sarah's role in orchestrating their healing, Riley's developing abilities, and the approaching federal investigation that would destroy their friend if they couldn't find a way to help it escape. The silence that followed his explanation lasted so long that Hal began to worry the call had been disconnected. "Elena, are you still there?" "I'm here," she said softly, "and I believe you." "You do?" "Hal, I've been studying indigenous legends and folklore for 30 years. I've heard too many similar stories from too many different sources to dismiss them as pure mythology. Besides, I've watched you and Riley transform over the past month from two people who could barely function to a family that's genuinely healing. Something extraordinary has been helping you, and it doesn't matter to me whether it comes from another planet or another dimension." Her acceptance felt like a gift beyond measure. "The federal team is moving in tomorrow morning. We're going to try to help our friend get safely away tonight. What do you need from me?" The question brought tears to his eyes. "Just know that if things go badly, if we end up in custody or missing or worse, we did what we did for love. For Sarah's memory, and for a being that crossed impossible distances just to heal our broken hearts. I understand. And Hal, whatever happens, I'm proud of you both for choosing courage over safety. After ending the call with Elena, Hal contacted Margaret with a more carefully edited version of the truth. He told her that he and Riley had discovered something in the mountains that the federal team would want to study and exploit, something that had been essential to their healing process, but couldn't survive the kind of clinical analysis that would follow discovery. "Are you talking about some kind of archaeological site?" Margaret asked. "Something like that. Margaret, if Dr. Williams asks about us after tonight, please remember that we've been good tenants and good friends to this community. Whatever happens, we're not the kind of people who would do anything to hurt innocent others." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Hal, you're scaring me. What exactly are you planning to do?" "Help a friend get home safely," he said simply. That afternoon, Riley left school early, claiming she felt sick, which wasn't entirely untrue given the nausea that accompanied her growing psychic sensitivity. Together, they hiked up to the cave through the back trails, taking a route that would be difficult for federal teams to monitor or follow. The star touched was waiting for them, its luminous form more agitated than they'd ever seen it. Through their connection, waves of distress and urgency poured from the being, along with complex images that took several minutes to decode. What they learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The star-touched could indeed return to its home among the stars, but only during specific celestial alignments that created the cosmic pathways necessary for such vast journeys. The next such alignment would occur tonight, just after midnight, when certain constellations reached their precise positions relative to Earth's magnetic field. But the departure process required more than just proper timing. The star touched needed to reach a specific location, the highest accessible peak in the immediate area, where it could establish the kind of energy beacon necessary to signal its people for retrieval. That peak was Mount Henderson, a technically challenging climb that would take them directly through the heart of the area, scheduled for federal investigation the next morning. More critically, the departure process required enormous amounts of emotional energy to complete, the same kind of love-driven force that had originally brought it to Earth in response to Sarah's prayer. The star-touched couldn't make the journey home alone. It needed Hal and Riley to maintain psychic contact throughout the entire process, channeling their love and healing energy to sustain the being during its transition back to whatever realm it called home. "How long will the process take?" Riley asked. Through their shared connection, the answer came in images of the Earth turning on its axis, the stars moving through their courses, the moon setting and the sun rising. The departure window would last from midnight until dawn, approximately 6 hours during which they would need to remain in constant psychic communion with the star touched while helping it reach the mountain peak and establish its beacon. 6 hours on the highest mountain in the region, in the middle of the area that would be swarming with federal agents by morning, maintaining an energy connection that would be visible to any monitoring equipment within a 50-mile radius. "It's impossible," Hal said aloud, though he was already calculating routes and timing in his mind. "We can't get to Mount Henderson and back without being detected. And even if we could, maintaining that kind of psychic connection for 6 hours would drain us completely." But Riley was studying the star charts the creature was sharing with them, her enhanced abilities allowing her to process information that Hal could barely comprehend. "Dad," she said quietly, "I don't think we're supposed to come back." The realization hit him like a physical blow. The star touched wasn't just showing them how to help it get home, it was showing them how to go with it. Through their deeper connection, more complex communications began flowing from the being. It was offering them something unprecedented, the chance to join Sarah in whatever realm existed beyond the physical universe. The departure process could include them if they chose, transforming their human consciousness into something capable of surviving the journey between stars. They could be reunited with Sarah, but only by leaving their earthly lives behind forever. "We can't," Hal whispered, though part of him was desperately tempted by the possibility of seeing Sarah again. "Riley has her whole life ahead of her. I can't ask her to give up everything just to be with Mom again." Riley's eyes were bright with tears, but also with something that looked like peace. "Dad, what exactly am I giving up? A world where people like Dr. Williams think beings like our friend should be locked up and studied. A life where I have to pretend I don't have these abilities that make me feel connected to something magnificent." Al stared at his daughter, seeing not the broken teenager he'd brought to Millbrook 6 months ago, but a young woman who had found her purpose in caring for something otherworldly and beautiful. The star touched had healed them both, but it had also changed them in ways that might make it impossible to return to ordinary human existence. "We have to decide tonight," he said finally. Riley nodded, reaching for his hand. "Whatever we choose together." Outside the cave, the sun was setting behind the mountains, and the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere among those distant lights was their friend's home, and possibly Sarah waiting to welcome them into whatever existed beyond the boundaries of mortal life. But first, they had to survive the most dangerous night of their lives. At 11:30 that night, Hal and Riley began what might be their final journey together on Earth. The star touched had transformed itself into a form more suitable for travel, condensing its luminous energy into a roughly human-shaped figure that could move alongside them through the darkness. The crystalline fragment in Hal's pocket pulsed in rhythm with the being's steps, maintaining their psychic connection even as they focused on the treacherous climb ahead. Mount Henderson's summit trail was challenging enough in daylight with proper equipment. Attempting it at night, while maintaining constant telepathic communication with an otherworldly being, pushed the boundaries of what seemed humanly possible. But Riley's enhanced abilities had grown stronger throughout the day, and she was able to share the star-touched's enhanced perception, allowing them to navigate obstacles that would have stopped them under normal circumstances. They reached the first checkpoint, a granite shelf approximately halfway to the summit, just as federal vehicles began arriving in the valley below. From their elevated position, Hal could see the lights of the mobile command unit being established near the base of the mountain, along with the heat signatures of search teams preparing to deploy at first light. "They're setting up a perimeter," Riley observed, her psychic awareness now extending far enough to sense the investigators' intentions. "Dr. Williams is planning to use helicopters to scan the entire area with electromagnetic sensors." The star touched communicated its understanding through waves of gratitude mixed with concern. It knew that Hal and Riley were risking everything to help it reach the departure point, and it was troubled by the danger they faced simply by being in its presence. But there was something else flowing through their connection, a sense of anticipation that suggested their friend was looking forward to something beyond simple escape. Through fragmented images, Hal began to understand that the star-touched's mission wasn't complete simply because it had healed their grief. There was another phase to Sarah's plan, something that required all of them to reach the summit together. The second half of the climb tested their endurance in ways Hal hadn't expected. As they gained altitude, the psychic connection with the star-touched began requiring more conscious effort to maintain, as if the Earth's magnetic field were somehow interfering with their telepathic bond. Riley struggled with the increasing energy demands, stopping frequently to rest and regain her psychic equilibrium. "I don't know if I can keep this up for 6 hours, she admitted during one rest break, her face pale with exhaustion. "It feels like the connection is trying to pull my consciousness right out of my body." The star-touched moved closer to both of them, placing its luminous hands on their shoulders in a gesture of support and energy sharing. Through the enhanced contact, Hal felt some of the being's own strength flowing into them, not enough to eliminate the challenges they faced, but sufficient to help them continue climbing. As they approached the final ascent to the summit, the first signs of pursuit became evident below. Helicopter searchlights were beginning to sweep the lower elevations, and Hal could make out small groups of federal agents working their way up the various trail systems with portable scanning equipment. "They know we're up here," he said, watching. The methodical search pattern developing in the valley probably picked up our energy signature on their monitors. Riley was studying the stars overhead with her enhanced perception, interpreting the celestial patterns that would guide their friend's departure process. "We have maybe 20 minutes before the alignment reaches its optimal configuration," she reported. "After that, the window starts closing." The summit of Mount Henderson was a relatively flat granite platform, roughly the size of a basketball court, surrounded on all sides by precipitous drops that made it accessible only by the single trail they'd just climbed. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an ideal location for the kind of energy beacon the Star Touch needed to establish. Isolated, elevated, and with clear sightlines to the sky in all directions. But tonight, it was about to become the focal point of a federal manhunt. As they reached the summit, the Star Touched immediately began the beacon activation process. Its form expanded and brightened, sending pillars of soft light streaming upward into the star-filled sky. The energy display was beautiful beyond description, but it was also visible for miles in every direction, a cosmic lighthouse that would draw every investigator in the area straight to their location. Through their psychic connection, Hal felt the Star Touch's consciousness reaching out across the vast distances between stars, sending the signal that would bring its people to retrieve it. But he also sensed something unexpected. The being was calling for more than just a simple rescue. It was requesting permission to bring passengers. "Riley," Hal said, his voice barely audible over the humming energy of the beacon, "I think our friend is asking its people if we can come with it." His daughter nodded, her eyes closed as she channeled energy into the departure process. "I can feel them responding," she whispered. They're saying yes." Below them in the darkness, the helicopter searchlights were converging on their location, and Hal could hear the voices of federal agents beginning the final ascent to the summit. The choice had to be made in seconds. Federal agents were less than 50 feet below them on the trail, their heavy boots scraping against granite as they climbed toward the summit. Dr. Williams' voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air, directing her team to surround the energy source and prepare containment equipment for whatever they found at the peak. Above them, the Star Touched's beacon was reaching its full intensity, sending streams of luminous energy spiraling upward into the constellation patterns that would guide its people to Earth. Through their psychic connection, Hal could feel the approaching presence of other beings, vast consciousnesses traveling at impossible speeds across the void between stars. "Dad," Riley whispered, her hand gripping his tightly as they knelt beside their luminous friend. "They're almost here. We have to decide now." Hal closed his eyes and felt for Sarah's presence in the cosmic communications flowing through the Star Touched. She was there, waiting just beyond the boundary between worlds, ready to welcome them into whatever existence lay beyond mortal life. The temptation to join her was overwhelming, to leave behind the pain and uncertainty of human existence and be reunited with the woman he'd loved more than life itself. But as he opened his heart to that possibility, another realization struck him with perfect clarity. Sarah hadn't arranged for their healing just so they could escape from the world she was leaving behind. She had prepared them to live fully in that world, to love deeply despite the risk of loss, to choose connection over protection even when it meant facing future grief. The Star Touched had healed them by teaching them that love transcends death, not by offering them a way to avoid mortality altogether. "We're staying," Hal said, his voice carrying absolute certainty despite the federal agents advancing toward them. "This is our world, our life, our chance to honor what Sarah taught us, about choosing love over fear." Riley's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She wanted us to heal so we could help others heal, didn't she? Not so we could run away from the chance to make a difference here. The Star-Touched's response flooded through their connection. Waves of profound respect and understanding, tinged with a sadness at their impending separation, but also deep approval of their choice. Through their shared awareness, Hal felt the being's gratitude for the healing they had facilitated, and its confidence that their work together had prepared them for whatever came next. But the federal team was almost upon them, and the Star-Touched couldn't complete its departure with hostile forces so close to the beacon. Something had to be done to protect the final phase of its journey home. That's when Riley made her own choice. Standing up from their position beside the beacon, she turned to face the trail where Dr. Williams and her agents were making their final approach. Her psychic abilities, enhanced by weeks of communion with the Star-Touched, reached out to touch the minds of everyone climbing toward them. What she shared with them wasn't fear or confusion, but the pure emotional truth of what they had experienced in that mountain cave. In an instant, Dr. Williams and her entire team felt the Star-Touched's gentle nature, its healing mission, and the profound love that had brought it across impossible distances to help two grieving humans find their way back to life. The federal agents stopped climbing, overwhelmed by the sudden understanding that they weren't pursuing a threat to be contained, but a miracle to be protected. Dr. Williams was the first to find her voice. "What is that thing?" She called up toward the summit, but her tone had changed from official authority to genuine wonder. "A friend," Hal called back. "Someone who came here to heal, not to harm. Someone who's going home now that its work is finished." Above them, the sky filled with lights that had nothing to do with stars or helicopters. The Star-Touched's people had arrived, a fleet of vessels that seemed to be made of living light, hovering at the edge of Earth's atmosphere with the patient grace of beings who measured time in geological ages rather than human heartbeats. The Star-Touched began its final transformation, its earthly form dissolving into pure energy that spiraled upward toward the waiting ships. But before the last of its consciousness departed, it sent one final gift through the psychic connection. It shared with Hal and Riley. For just a moment, they felt Sarah's presence with perfect clarity, not as memory or imagination, but as a continuing reality that existed beyond the boundaries of physical death. She was whole, she was at peace, and she was enormously proud of the courage they had shown in choosing to remain connected to life and love, despite all the pain that connection might bring. "Thank you," her voice whispered through their hearts. "Now go help others learn to heal." The Star-Touched completed its departure in a cascade of light that illuminated the entire mountain range, visible to anyone within 100 miles who happened to be looking up at the sky. Then it was gone, leaving behind only the crystalline fragment in Hal's pocket and the transformed hearts of everyone who had witnessed its return to the stars. In the sudden silence that followed, Dr. Williams and her team completed their climb to the summit, finding Hal and Riley sitting peacefully on the granite platform, looking up at the now ordinary stars with expressions of profound gratitude and completion. 6 months later, Hal stood at the entrance to what had once been a mysterious cave and was now something much more significant, a place of pilgrimage for people seeking healing from grief and loss. The Millbrook County Council had designated the site as a protected natural area, and the museum had established a small visitor center nearby to help manage the steady stream of people who traveled from across the country to experience what locals had begun calling the Healing Cave. Dr. Williams had surprised everyone by becoming the site's most vocal advocate. Her official report to the federal agencies had been a masterpiece of scientific diplomacy, describing the anomalous energy event as a naturally occurring phenomenon, worthy of preservation and study rather than exploitation. She had taken early retirement from government work and now served as the site's volunteer scientific coordinator, helping visitors understand the difference between genuine spiritual experience and wishful thinking. The electromagnetic readings are still unusual, she told a group of doctoral students she was training as research assistants. But whatever was generating the original anomaly has moved on, leaving behind something more subtle but equally fascinating. Measurable changes in the human subjects who spend time in sustained meditation here. Riley, now 18 and preparing for college in the fall, had developed a reputation as an extraordinarily gifted counselor for people dealing with traumatic loss. Her enhanced empathic abilities, tempered by months of learning to control and channel them appropriately, allowed her to connect with grieving individuals in ways that conventional therapy couldn't match. She spent her afternoons at the cave site, offering what she called grief companionship to visitors who needed someone who truly understood their pain. The hardest part isn't learning to live with loss, she explained to a middle-aged man whose wife had died in a car accident the previous year. It's learning to trust that staying open to love is worth the risk of being hurt again. Hal watched his daughter work with visitors, marveling at the wisdom she'd gained from their extraordinary experience. The broken teenager he'd brought to Millbrook had become a young woman capable of helping others navigate the most difficult transitions life could offer. Sarah would have been proud of who Riley had become, not despite their loss, but because of how they had chosen to transform that loss into service to others. His own life had settled into patterns that felt both familiar and entirely new. He continued working at the museum, but his role had evolved to include managing the historical documentation of what they were now calling the Millbrook Contact Event. Researchers from universities around the world came to study the accounts of that night on Mount Henderson, and Hal had become the official keeper of those testimonies. Elena had moved in with them 3 months ago, bringing her extensive library, and her gift for making any space feel like home. Their relationship had developed with the patient care of two people who understood that love was too precious to rush or take for granted. She wore Sarah's ring on a chain around her neck, not as a replacement, but as a reminder that some bonds transcend the boundaries between life and death. "How many visitors today?" Elena asked, finding Hal in the cave entrance where he liked to sit and remember during the quiet hours before closing. 43, he replied, moving over to make room for her on the stone bench that volunteers had installed for contemplation. "Including a woman who drove here from Nova Scotia because she heard about Riley's work with people who've lost children." Elena settled beside him, her presence as comforting as it had become familiar. "Riley helped her for 3 hours. When they finished, the woman said it was the first time since her son's death that she'd been able to imagine feeling joy again someday." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last of the day's visitors make their way down the mountain trail. The cave itself was empty now, except for the subtle energy that seemed to permeate the stone walls, not the dramatic luminescence of the star-touched presence, but something gentler and more enduring. People often reported feeling unexpectedly peaceful after spending time in the space, as if some residue of cosmic compassion had been permanently absorbed into the limestone. "Any regrets?" Eleanor asked, a question she posed periodically with the gentle directness that had drawn him to her. Hal considered the question seriously, as he always did. 6 months ago, he and Riley had faced the choice between rejoining Sarah in whatever realm existed beyond physical death and remaining on Earth to continue the healing work she had made possible. Some nights, especially when he missed her presence, with particular intensity, he wondered if they had chosen correctly, but then he would think about the people Riley had helped find their way through grief, or the researchers who were using their experience to develop better understanding of consciousness and healing, or the simple fact that their story had given hope to thousands of people who had read about it in the carefully managed media coverage that followed Dr. Williams's report. Sarah's final gift hadn't been the opportunity to escape from life, but the chance to live it more fully than he had ever imagined possible. "No regrets," he said, taking Elena's hand. Just gratitude for whatever force in the universe arranges for broken people to find exactly what they need to heal. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that reminded him of the star-touched's luminous form, Hal felt the crystalline fragment pulse gently in his pocket. The connection was still there, faint but unmistakable, a reminder that love, once established, never truly ends. It simply transforms into new possibilities for connection, new opportunities for healing, new ways of choosing light over darkness. Even in the face of inevitable loss, in the distance, he could see Riley walking up the trail with Elena's teenage nephew, who had been visiting for the summer and struggling with his own family losses. She was showing him the techniques she had developed for managing overwhelming emotions, sharing the wisdom she had gained from an otherworldly being who had traveled across impossible distances just to teach two grieving humans that healing was always possible. The star-touched had gone home, but its work continued in every person who chose connection over isolation, love over fear, and hope over despair. Some gifts, Hal realized, were meant to be passed on.